Our next guest is author of several books, including her latest, which is a book that gives a glimpse of life in Central America, called Land of Deep Waters, Patricia Robertson. Hi, Patricia, how are you?
Good.
Nice to see you.
Good to meet you.
Welcome to the show. Well, we've got, you know, the Central America immigration issue in the news. Hundreds, maybe thousands of children coming north into the United States from Honduras and other Central American countries. In your book, actually goes back 30 years to...
Right. 1974 through 78. It's kind of written in a retrospect, and it's the story of a sister who was there when she was young, and she witnessed a number of atrocities being there, and she was friends with the priest that was there, and at one point in time when she went home because she'd had back problems, she was not allowed to come back. So after 4 years there, she wasn't allowed to come back, and she really was haunted by the memories of that. But since she couldn't come back, she eventually left the sisterhood, got married, had a couple children, and was working for a Catholic Charities organization. But she kept remembering, you know, the children of Honduras and the people of Honduras. So 30 years later, she goes back. So the first part of the book is talking about 1974 and 1978 and her experiences there, as well as the stories of a priest who was a friend of hers, her Father Paul. And then she comes back and visits Father Paul again, and just kind of, they're there for the 30th anniversary of the martyrs of Olancho, where 12 peasants and 2 priests were killed in one night. So they came back for that memorial service. So she's there for that.
But it's a novel. It's fiction.
It's a novel. It's a novel. It's based on some history, and you know the story of the priest was a friend of mine. He had been actually in his case, he was the one who couldn't go back, and he was a good friend, and I interviewed him extensively. This was good 30 years ago or so, and he told me his story, and I wrote it down at that point in time because I just thought it was a wonderful story, but it wasn't that well written. I kept it for a good 25 years, and finally I pulled it out because I just knew it was a good story there, and I took it, rewrote it, decided to put in the sister and have it from her perspective, and then have it a retrospect of her looking back at 30 years later of what happened when she was there.
So just knowing this person, that was enough to get you to write the book?
Not just knowing him, he was a big influence, but also I'd spent a summer in the Dominican Republic in 1980, and I saw, you know, some of the children and some of the inequities with what they had and what I had growing up, middle class. I had a great lifestyle, and they had so little. So that really got me thinking about that. And then when I met Father Preston, we just became friends, and he introduced me to this wonderful book on conscientization by Leonidas Proaños. And in the story, he talked about, it's not a story, it's a book, and it talks about the conscientious raising process, where some people go and they see the suffering and they are moved by it, but right away they go to charity. So they'll give them some clothing, they'll give them food, but they don't let it go any deeper. And what I wanted to do is let it go deeper. As you let it go deeper, you start to see things differently, and you try to see it from their perspective. And so in the book, I wanted to lead people through that process of going deeper, and not just being on the superficial and just right away, well, I'm going to do this because it makes me feel better if I give them this to take care of it. But to look at, and at the end you look at what structurally is causing the inequities, and why is there so much starving and poverty, and you know the problems of violence that are there in Honduras and Central America. So the idea is to hopefully get people thinking that and going a little bit deeper.
Well, what is the tragedy in Honduras? It's not just poverty. Is it poverty that is causing other problems?
It's a lot of the problem is the vast majority of the land is in like about 5% of the population, and the rest of the people are just struggling. So when I was in Dominican Republic, you would see these beautiful expanses, and they would have I think what they told me was the cows were there for our McDonald's. Meanwhile, these farmers could not find a piece of land that they could farm. So it was just very hard to see that, or is that land that could have been used for the farmers to be self-sufficient and provide a life for their family. So that's a lot of it. A lot of it's the land inequities. And then corruption in their government. And it's like, I don't know how often, sometimes you can get 2 or 3 coups in 1 year in Latin America. So they're constantly getting changeover in government. A new person comes in, they think it's going to be better, and then even if it starts to get better, somebody else might come along, or it just doesn't go that far as the actual change.
So all these bad things that are happening in Honduras and other Central American countries, that's what's causing the influx of the young, the immigrants that are coming over the border, in some cases buses and trucks.
Right. Well, and I think with the children, it's a problem with gangs. I had communicated with a woman she's in charge of the Lamb Institute in Tegucigalpa, which is the capital of Honduras, and she'd lived in a slum area, lots of violence and lots of gangs, and she told me that the biggest problem is the gangs right now. The kids are either forced to join the gangs or they risk dying, being killed by the gangs. So many of their parents are just scraping together enough money to try to send them to United States to get them away from that problem. So that, she said, is the biggest issue.
It's hard to imagine. People are sacrificing their lives with their children. So they
Right. And it's a great risk. It's not a safe journey. There was a wonderful book, I think it was Enrique's Journey. It was part of the One Community in Michigan State. And it was the story of this young boy who rode a train in order to cross into our, the border through Mexico. And it was horrendous what this young boy went through. So it's not a safe journey at all. They're sacrificing an awful lot to have these children come here.
You start each chapter of the book with a quote. What's the purpose of that?
The quote, it's each section, and there's 4 sections, and each one is a quote from the book by Proaños to kind of give you the idea. So the first section is going there. Proaños says, unless we get ourselves out of our comfortable place and actually go to a place where we can see something different, we'll never change. So there's a quote to that effect. The second one is going deeper, where he says, you can't just be on the surface, you got to go a little bit deeper to understand what are the underlying cause of all the problems. And then the third one is going into action. He says, after you have experienced this and have really gotten to a sense for what the people are dealing with and need, then you just have to take action in some form. And so in that case, we talk about some of the political action that the campesinos were trying to unionize and organize to better their life. And then the last one is going back. And that's where she is 30 years later, and she decides to go back. And the idea is that once you've been there and had this experience, you kind of have to keep going back. The people call you back. There's this wonderful quote from Ana Olancho. It says, I can't remember the Spanish, but it's basically that once you have Olancho in your heart, you really can never leave it. And so that's her thing. She's got Olancho, she's got Honduras in her heart, and so she has to come back because the people are there with her, and she just can't quite leave it. And then there's the struggle, what do I do now? Do I leave my current position, and my husband, her children are grown, so it's not like they would need her care, but do I move down to Honduras in order to take up where I left off, or where is God calling her? So that's a big issue in the last section. What is God calling her to do? Or does she stay in her country and try to work to better the lives of the people in Central America?
And your second quote being about deep, is that tying into the title of the book?
Yes, yeah, deep waters. Honduras itself means land of deep waters. But I thought there was a nice connection with the idea of going deeper, that the idea of raising your consciousness is going deeper, not just living life on the surface, but we want to go deeper.
Our guest, Patricia Robertson, author of Land of Deep Waters. Land of Deep Waters. About Honduras, civil unrest and poverty, but you've also written other books, which we're going to talk about those when we continue here in just a moment. Stay tuned.